30 Sunday dinners from Betty Crocker's 1950s cookbook were on every American table.
They converse pleasantly while Dad serves. I said pleasantly, for that is the keynote at dinner time.
Crown roast of pork, chicken, and dumplings. Swiss steak. They cost under $5 and fed 8 people. Today, you won't find a single one. They vanished when convenience replaced technique.
Now, remember to gently fold in the dry ingredients, dear.
Oh, right. Almost forgot that step.
But these weren't just meals. They were traditions that brought families together. We're bringing them back. Here's number 1. Let's start with the king of 1950s Sunday dinners, the crown roast of pork. This wasn't just a roast. This was a statement. Picture this: 12 to 16 pork chops, still connected, arranged in a circle and tied to form a crown. The center filled with savory stuffing, each rib bone topped with a paper frill. This was the dish that said, "We're doing Sunday dinner right." In 1955, this roast cost about $3.50. That's roughly $38 today. But here's the thing. You can't even find this cut at most grocery stores anymore. You'd have to special order it from a butcher, and it would cost you over $100. The preparation was an all-morning affair. You'd start by making the stuffing: bread cubes, onions, celery, sage, and butter. The roast would go into the oven at 325 degrees for about 3 hours. The house would fill with that unmistakable aroma of roasting pork and herbs. Kids would keep wandering into the kitchen asking, "Is it ready yet?" Next up, chicken and dumplings, the ultimate comfort food that somehow became uncomfortable for modern cooks. This was Sunday dinner in a pot. You'd start with a whole chicken, not chicken breasts, a whole bird, simmered for hours until the meat fell off the bone. The broth would be rich, golden, almost thick from all the collagen. Then came the dumplings: flour, baking powder, milk, and butter, dropped by spoonfuls into that bubbling broth. In 1952, a whole chicken cost about 65 cents. That's roughly $7 today. Now, a whole chicken costs about $8 to $12, so the price hasn't changed much. But the time investment? That's where everything changed. This dish took 4 hours from start to finish. You couldn't rush it. The chicken needed at least 2 hours of simmering to develop that deep flavor. The dumplings had to cook for exactly 15 minutes. Too little, and they'd be doughy. Too long, and they'd fall apart. Betty Crocker's recipe called for a specific technique. You'd make the dumplings light and fluffy by not overmixing the batter. Just stir until combined, she instructed. Drop them gently onto the simmering chicken. Don't peek for 15 minutes. That "don't peek" instruction was crucial. Every time you lifted the lid, you'd release steam, and the dumplings wouldn't rise properly. Swiss steak, and no, it has nothing to do with Switzerland. This was the dish that turned a tough, cheap cut of beef into something tender and magnificent. You'd take a round steak, one of the toughest cuts available, and literally pound flour into it with a meat mallet. Then you'd brown it in a cast-iron skillet, add tomatoes, onions, and celery, and let it simmer for 2 hours until that tough meat became fork tender. In 1950, round steak cost about 45 cents per pound. That's roughly $6 today. A family-sized portion would cost about $2 total. The genius of Swiss steak was in the technique. That pounding process, called Swissing, broke down the tough muscle fibers. The long, slow braising in tomato sauce finished the job. What started as shoe leather became melt-in-your-mouth tender. Betty Crocker's version included a secret ingredient, a tablespoon of vinegar added to the tomato sauce. That acid helped break down the meat even further and brightened all the flavors. This dish disappeared when Americans fell in love with grilling in the 1960s and 70s. Baked ham with pineapple, the dish that defined mid-century American cuisine. This was Betty Crocker at her most iconic. A bone-in ham, scored in a diamond pattern, studded with whole cloves, glazed with brown sugar and pineapple juice, and decorated with pineapple rings secured with maraschino cherries. It looked like something from a magazine cover. And in 1950s America, it probably was. A whole bone-in ham cost about $4 in 1955, roughly $43 today. But that ham would feed 12 to 15 people, making it incredibly economical. The leftovers would last all week. Ham sandwiches, ham and beans, ham-fried rice, ham salad. The preparation was pure theater. You'd score the fat in a diamond pattern, making sure not to cut into the meat. Then you'd press a whole clove into each diamond intersection. The glaze went on in layers, first a mixture of brown sugar and mustard, then pineapple rings arranged in a spiral pattern, each one secured with a bright red cherry and a toothpick. It would bake for about 2 hours at 325 degrees, every 30 minutes. You'd baste it with more pineapple juice and pan drippings. The kitchen would smell like a tropical paradise mixed with brown sugar and cloves. Here's what made this dish special. That combination of sweet and savory was revolutionary for its time. Before the 1950s, American food tended to be straightforward. Meat was savory, dessert was sweet, and never the two shall meet. But post-war prosperity brought new ingredients and new ideas. Pineapple was exotic, modern, sophisticated. The dish disappeared when we decided sweet and savory combinations were dated or retro in a bad way. By the 1980s, food magazines were calling this kind of cooking unsophisticated. We moved toward cleaner flavors, whatever that means. But you know what? This ham was delicious. That glaze created a caramelized crust that was absolutely addictive. The pineapple juice kept the meat incredibly moist, and yes, it looked spectacular on the table. Beef pot roast with vegetables, the original one-pot wonder. This was Sunday dinner in its purest form. A 3-pound chuck roast, seared until deeply browned, then braised for 3 hours with carrots, potatoes, onions, and celery. Everything cooked together in one pot. The meat became tender. The vegetables absorbed all those rich, beefy flavors. And the braising liquid turned into the most incredible gravy you've ever tasted. In 1950, a chuck roast cost about 50 cents per pound. A 3-pound roast would run you about $1.50, roughly $16 today. Add another 50 cents for vegetables, and you had a complete meal for $2. That's about $22 in today's money, feeding 6 to 8 people. Betty Crocker's technique was specific. Brown the meat on all sides first. Don't skip this step. That browning creates flavor compounds that make everything taste richer. Then add just enough liquid to come halfway up the meat, not too much, or you're boiling instead of braising. Cover tightly. Cook low and slow. The vegetables went in during the last hour. Potatoes cut in quarters, carrots in big chunks, onions cut in wedges. Everything had to be large enough to withstand an hour of cooking without turning to mush. The pot roast disappeared because of the slow cooker. In the 1970s, crock pots promised the same results with less attention. Just throw everything in, turn it on, and leave for work. Problem? Slow cookers don't brown meat. They don't reduce liquids. They don't create that same depth of flavor. A proper pot roast requires attention. You have to check it, baste it, adjust the heat. But that attention is what makes it special. This wasn't just cooking, it was tending, caring, creating something wonderful through patience and technique. We're only 5 recipes in, and you're already seeing the pattern. Every single one of these dishes required time, technique, and attention. They weren't complicated, they were careful. But here's where it gets interesting. The next 5 recipes are even more forgotten than these. We're talking about dishes that haven't appeared on an American dinner table in 40 years. Dishes that used techniques most modern cooks have never even heard of. These aren't just recipes. They're time capsules. They're windows into a way of cooking and a way of living that we've completely lost. Let's keep going. Chicken fricassee, a word most people can't even pronounce anymore, let alone cook. This was the elegant cousin of chicken and dumplings. You'd cut a whole chicken into pieces, dredge them in flour, brown them in butter, then simmer them in cream sauce with mushrooms and pearl onions. The result was rich, velvety, and absolutely luxurious. In 1952, this dish cost about $1.25 to make, roughly $14 today. The cream was the expensive part. Heavy cream cost about 30 cents per pint back then, compared to about $4 today. But that cream is what made the dish special. It created a sauce so rich and silky that you wanted to lick the plate. Betty Crocker's technique involved a specific order of operations. Brown the chicken pieces in butter until golden. Remove them. Make a roux with the butter and flour left in the pan. Add chicken stock slowly, whisking constantly. Add cream. Return the chicken to the sauce. Simmer gently for 45 minutes. The word fricassee comes from French, meaning to cut up and cook in sauce. But this wasn't fancy French cuisine. It was American home cooking with French roots. The technique had been passed down through generations, simplified and adapted for American kitchens and American ingredients. This dish disappeared because of the fat phobia of the 1980s and 90s. Suddenly, cream and butter were the enemy. Cookbooks started featuring light versions made with skim milk and margarine, but those versions missed the entire point. The richness wasn't a bug, it was the feature. That cream sauce was the reason the dish existed. Braised short ribs, before they became a trendy restaurant dish, they were Sunday dinner. These were the ribs nobody wanted. Tough, fatty, full of bones. They cost about 30 cents per pound in 1950, roughly $3 today. Butchers practically gave them away, but with the right technique, they became absolutely incredible. Betty Crocker's method was straightforward. Season the ribs with salt and pepper, brown them in a hot oven, then braise them in beef stock with onions, carrots, and tomatoes for 3 hours. The meat would become so tender it fell off the bone. The fat would render out, making the sauce incredibly rich. Those tough, cheap ribs would taste like the most expensive cut of beef you'd ever eaten. The key was patience. You couldn't rush this dish. The first hour, nothing seemed to happen. The second hour, the meat started to soften. The third hour, magic occurred. The collagen broke down into gelatin, giving the sauce a luxurious, almost sticky texture. The meat fibers separated, becoming tender and succulent. In 1950s homes, this dish was pure economy. You took the cheapest cut available and turned it into something special. It fed a family of 6 for under $2. Then, something changed. In the 2000s, fancy restaurants discovered short ribs. Suddenly, they were charging $30 for a plate of braised short ribs. The price of the meat shot up. What cost 30 cents per pound in 1950 and should cost about $3 today now costs $8 to $12 per pound. We took a cheap, humble dish and made it expensive. That's exactly backward from what Sunday dinner was supposed to be about. Salmon loaf with egg sauce. Yes, you read that right. A loaf made of salmon. This was the dish that defined 1950s resourcefulness. You'd take canned salmon, the cheap stuff, with bones and skin still in it, mix it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, form it into a loaf, and bake it. Then you'd serve it with a rich egg sauce made from hard-boiled eggs chopped into white sauce. A can of salmon cost about 35 cents in 1950. That's roughly $4 today. Add breadcrumbs, eggs, and milk, and the total cost was maybe 60 cents, about $7 in today's money. This fed 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe was specific about the canned salmon. Don't remove the bones or skin. Mash them right into the mixture. Those bones were pure calcium, and they'd soften during baking. The skin added flavor and helped hold everything together. The egg sauce was pure indulgence. Butter, flour, milk, and chopped hard-boiled eggs. It turned the simple salmon loaf into something that felt fancy, special, Sunday-worthy. This dish disappeared because we became squeamish. Those bones and skin that our grandmothers mashed right in, modern cooks found them off-putting. Canned salmon itself fell out of favor. We wanted fresh fish or nothing, but here's what we lost. This was sustainable eating before sustainability was trendy. Every part of the salmon was used. Nothing was wasted. And that egg sauce? It was a way to make a simple protein feel luxurious without spending a fortune. Stuffed pork chops, the dish that turned an ordinary weeknight cut into Sunday dinner. You'd buy thick-cut pork chops, at least 1.5 inches thick. Then you'd cut a pocket into each chop and fill it with sage stuffing. The chops would bake for an hour, and the stuffing would soak up all those pork juices, becoming incredibly flavorful and moist. In 1955, thick pork chops cost about 40 cents per pound. 4 chops would run you about 80 cents. Roughly $9 today. The stuffing added maybe 20 cents to the cost. Total, $1 for a meal that fed 4 people. Betty Crocker's technique required a sharp knife and a steady hand. You'd hold the chop flat on the cutting board, then carefully cut into the side, creating a pocket without cutting all the way through. The pocket had to be large enough to hold plenty of stuffing, but not so large that it would fall apart during cooking. The stuffing was simple: bread cubes, onion, celery, sage, and just enough chicken broth to moisten everything. You'd pack it firmly into each pocket, then secure the opening with toothpicks. These chops would bake at 350 degrees for about an hour. The pork would stay incredibly juicy because the stuffing acted as insulation, keeping the meat from drying out. Every bite had pork and stuffing together. You didn't need anything else. This dish disappeared when pork chops got thinner. By the 1980s, grocery stores were cutting pork chops only 1/2 inch thick, too thin to stuff. The industry decided thinner was better because it cooked faster. They were wrong. Those thin chops dried out in minutes. The thick, stuffed chops stayed juicy and flavorful. Creamed chipped beef, which soldiers called something else entirely, but we'll keep this family-friendly. This was Sunday breakfast or Sunday supper, depending on your family's traditions. You'd take dried beef, paper-thin slices of beef that had been salted and dried, and make a rich cream sauce with butter, flour, and milk. Serve it over toast points, and you had a meal that was filling, satisfying, and incredibly cheap. A jar of dried beef cost about 25 cents in 1950. That's roughly $3 today. Add milk, butter, and bread, and the total cost was maybe 50 cents, about $5.50 in today's money. This fed 4 to 6 people. Betty Crocker's recipe had a crucial first step: rinse the dried beef. This stuff was salty, incredibly salty. If you didn't rinse it, your cream sauce would be inedible. After rinsing, you'd tear the beef into bite-sized pieces and sauté it briefly in butter. Then you'd make a roux, add milk, and simmer until thick. The result was comfort food at its finest. Rich, creamy, with that distinctive dried beef flavor that's hard to describe if you've never had it. Salty, slightly tangy, deeply savory. This dish disappeared because dried beef disappeared. By the 1980s, most grocery stores stopped carrying it. The few that did tucked it away in the deli section, charging premium prices for what used to be a cheap staple. Younger generations never learned to make it, never even tasted it. But in 1950s America, this was Sunday dinner for millions of families. It was quick, cheap, filling, and delicious. That's a combination we could use more of today. Roast chicken with bread stuffing. Before rotisserie chickens, this was how it was done. You'd buy a whole roasting chicken, 5 to 6 pounds. In 1950, that cost about 60 cents, roughly $7 today. You'd make bread stuffing with onions, celery, sage, and butter. You'd stuff the cavity, truss the bird, and roast it for 2.5 hours. The result was a chicken with crispy golden skin and incredibly moist meat, and stuffing that had absorbed all those chicken juices. Betty Crocker's technique was specific. Stuff the chicken loosely. If you pack it too tight, the stuffing won't cook through. Truss the legs together with kitchen string to keep the stuffing inside and help the chicken cook evenly. Rub the skin with butter and season generously with salt and pepper. The chicken would roast at 350 degrees. Every 30 minutes, you'd baste it with pan drippings. This kept the skin from drying out and created that beautiful golden color. The key to perfect roast chicken was temperature. Betty Crocker insisted on using a meat thermometer. The chicken was done when the thickest part of the thigh reached 180 degrees. Not before, not after. This dish disappeared because of convenience. By the 1990s, every grocery store had a hot case full of rotisserie chickens for $5 or $6. Why spend 2.5 hours when you could buy one ready-made? But here's what we lost: the stuffing. Rotisserie chickens don't come with stuffing. And stuffing cooked inside the bird, absorbing all those juices, is completely different from stuffing baked in a pan. It's richer, more flavorful, more satisfying. We traded quality for convenience and called it progress. Beef stroganoff, the dish that made every 1950s housewife feel like a gourmet chef. This was Russian cuisine adapted for American kitchens. You'd take beef tenderloin, the most expensive cut, slice it thin, sauté it quickly with mushrooms and onions, then finish it with sour cream. Serve it over egg noodles, and you had something that felt restaurant fancy but was actually quite simple. In 1955, beef tenderloin cost about $1 per pound. That's roughly $11 today. A pound and a half would feed 6 people, so the total cost was about $1.50, maybe $17 in today's money. Add mushrooms, sour cream, and noodles, and you were looking at about $2.50 total, roughly $27 today. Betty Crocker's version simplified the traditional Russian recipe. Instead of making a complex sauce, she just used sour cream stirred in at the end. Instead of beef stock, she used the pan drippings from the mushrooms and onions. The result was easier but still delicious. The key was cooking the beef quickly. You'd slice it thin, about a 1/4 inch, and sauté it in batches over high heat. Each batch took only 2 to 3 minutes. If you crowded the pan or cooked it too long, the beef would become tough. This dish disappeared because beef tenderloin got expensive, really expensive. That cut that cost $1 per pound in 1955 now costs $30 to $40 per pound. What used to be an affordable Sunday splurge became a special occasion-only luxury. Modern versions use cheaper cuts like sirloin or even stew meat, but those versions miss the entire point. Stroganoff was supposed to be tender, quick cooking, melt-in-your-mouth beef. With tough cuts, you're just making beef stew with sour cream. Baked stuffed fish, usually a whole white fish, stuffed with breadcrumb dressing and baked until flaky and golden. This was Sunday dinner for families who lived near water. You'd buy a whole fish, 3 to 4 pounds, from the local fishmonger. In 1950, a whole whitefish cost about 40 cents per pound. That's roughly $4.50 today. The entire fish would cost maybe $1.50, about $17 in today's money. The preparation was impressive. You'd scale and gut the fish, or have the fishmonger do it. Then you'd make a simple stuffing, breadcrumbs, onion, celery, lemon zest, and butter. You'd stuff the cavity, sew it closed with kitchen string, and bake it at 375 degrees for about 45 minutes. Betty Crocker's recipe included a clever trick. Score the skin diagonally every 2 inches. This helped the fish cook evenly and made it easier to serve. The scores would open up during baking, creating an attractive presentation. The result was spectacular. The fish would be moist and flaky. The stuffing would be crispy on top and soft inside, flavored with all those fish juices. You'd bring the whole fish to the table and serve it right from the baking dish. This dish disappeared because Americans stopped buying whole fish. We wanted fillets, boneless, skinless, portion-controlled. We didn't want to deal with heads, tails, bones, or skin. Fish went from being an ingredient you prepared to being a product you heated up, but cooking a whole fish teaches you something important: how to respect the ingredient, how to use every part, how to create something beautiful from something whole. That's a lesson worth learning. Veal cutlets with mushroom sauce. Before veal became controversial, it was Sunday dinner. You'd buy thin veal cutlets, pound them even thinner, dredge them in flour, and pan-fry them in butter. Then you'd make a quick mushroom sauce in the same pan. The whole dish took about 30 minutes, but tasted like something from a fancy restaurant. In 1950, veal cutlets cost about 80 cents per pound. That's roughly $9 today. A pound and a half would feed 4 people. Add mushrooms and cream, and the total cost was about $1.50, roughly $17 today. Betty Crocker's technique was all about that pounding step. You'd place each cutlet between 2 sheets of waxed paper and pound it with a meat mallet until it was about a 1/4 inch thick. This made the veal incredibly tender and helped it cook quickly, only 2 minutes per side. The mushroom sauce was simple. Sauté sliced mushrooms in the pan drippings, add a splash of white wine to deglaze, then finish with cream. The sauce would be ready in 5 minutes. This dish disappeared for ethical reasons. By the 1980s, people learned about veal production, how calves were raised in small crates, unable to move. The industry practices were cruel, and consumers responded by boycotting veal. Sales plummeted. Some producers have since reformed their practices, raising veal more humanely, but the damage was done. An entire generation grew up never eating veal, never learning to cook it. The recipes were forgotten. Whether you choose to cook veal today is a personal decision, but it's worth knowing that this was once a beloved Sunday dinner, and the recipe represents an important part of American culinary history. Lamb stew with spring vegetables. Lamb stew with spring vegetables, the dish that marked the end of winter and the arrival of fresh, tender spring produce. This was seasonal cooking before seasonal cooking was trendy. You'd make this stew in March or April when the first spring vegetables appeared: baby carrots, new potatoes, fresh peas, pearl onions. The lamb would be from spring lambs, young and tender. Everything in the pot represented renewal and freshness. In 1950, lamb shoulder cost about 45 cents per pound. That's roughly $5 today. 2 pounds would cost 90 cents, about $10 today. Add the vegetables, and the total cost was maybe $1.50, roughly $17 in today's money. Betty Crocker's recipe started with browning the lamb cubes in batches. This was crucial. Don't crowd the pan, or the meat will steam instead of brown. After browning, you'd add stock, wine, and herbs, then simmer for 90 minutes until the lamb was tender. The vegetables went in during the last 30 minutes. Baby carrots, quartered new potatoes, pearl onions, and fresh peas. Everything had to be timed perfectly, so nothing overcooked. The result was a stew that tasted like spring, light, fresh, vibrant. The lamb was tender but not falling apart. The vegetables still had texture and brightness. The broth was rich but not heavy. This dish disappeared because Americans stopped eating lamb. In 1950, lamb was common. By 2000, it had become exotic. Most grocery stores carried only a few cuts, and those were expensive. People forgot how to cook it, forgot what it tasted like, but lamb stew is worth reviving. It's delicious, satisfying, and connects us to the seasons in a way that few modern dishes do. 15 recipes down, 15 more to go. We're now entering truly obscure territory.
Remember to baste it every 15 minutes, just like we always do, dear.
The recipes you're about to see haven't appeared in a mainstream cookbook in 50 years. These are the deep cuts, the dishes that only appeared in Betty Crocker's 1950s editions, the ones that were forgotten even before most of us were born. But here's why they matter. These recipes represent techniques, flavors, and approaches to cooking that we've completely lost. They're not just food history, they're a masterclass in resourcefulness, patience, and making something wonderful from simple ingredients. Let's finish strong. Chicken paprikash. Chicken paprikash, Hungarian comfort food adapted for American Sunday tables. This was immigrant cuisine before we called it that. You'd cut a whole chicken into pieces, brown them in lard, then simmer them in a sauce made with onions, paprika, and sour cream. The result was rich, tangy, and deeply flavorful. In 1950, this dish cost about $1 to make, roughly $11 today. The most expensive ingredient was the sour cream, which cost about 30 cents per pint. Betty Crocker's recipe called for Hungarian paprika specifically, not the bland stuff from the grocery store spice aisle, but real Hungarian paprika with depth and complexity. This was important. The paprika wasn't just a garnish or a color, it was the soul of the dish. The technique was simple, but required attention. You'd sauté onions until golden, add paprika and stir for just 30 seconds. Any longer and it would burn. Then add the chicken and liquid. The chicken would simmer for 45 minutes. At the very end, you'd stir in sour cream, being careful not to let it boil, or it would curdle. This dish disappeared as Hungarian immigrants assimilated, and their children stopped cooking traditional foods. By the 1970s, chicken paprikash had become a curiosity, something you might find in an ethnic restaurant, but not in home kitchens. But this dish deserves a comeback. It's easy, affordable, and absolutely delicious. That combination of paprika and sour cream creates a flavor profile that's unlike anything else in American cooking. Stuffed cabbage rolls. Eastern European tradition wrapped in American convenience. You'd take a whole cabbage, core it, and boil it until the leaves were pliable. Then you'd peel off the leaves one by one, fill each with a mixture of ground beef, rice, and seasonings, roll them up, and simmer them in tomato sauce for 2 hours. In 1950, this entire dish cost about 80 cents to make, roughly $9 today. A head of cabbage cost about 10 cents. Ground beef was about 40 cents per pound. Rice was practically free. Betty Crocker's version simplified the traditional recipe by using tomato soup instead of fresh tomatoes. This was peak 1950s innovation, using processed convenience products to make traditional dishes easier. The technique required patience. Each cabbage roll had to be assembled individually. You'd place a spoonful of filling on each leaf, fold in the sides, and roll it up tightly. Then you'd arrange them seam side down in a baking dish, cover them with sauce, and bake for 2 hours. The result was tender cabbage leaves wrapped around savory, flavorful filling, all bathed in rich tomato sauce. You'd serve them with a dollop of sour cream on top. This dish disappeared because it was labor-intensive. Each roll took time to assemble. Modern cooks looked for shortcuts. Casseroles, one-pot meals, anything faster. But those shortcuts missed the entire point: the careful assembly, the individual rolls, the patient simmering. That was what made the dish special. Liver and onions, the dish that divided families and tested children's resolve. You either loved it or hated it. There was no middle ground. But in 1950s America, liver appeared on Sunday dinner tables regularly because it was cheap, nutritious, and, if cooked properly, actually delicious. Beef liver cost about 30 cents per pound in 1950. That's roughly $3.30 today. A pound and a half would feed 4 people. Add onions, and the total cost was maybe 40 cents, about $4.50 in today's money. Betty Crocker's technique was crucial. Don't overcook the liver. That was the mistake everyone made. Overcooked liver became tough, grainy, and bitter. Properly cooked liver, just 3 to 4 minutes per side, stayed tender and had a rich, almost creamy texture. You'd start by soaking the liver in milk for 30 minutes. This removed any bitter flavor. Then you'd pat it dry, dredge it in flour, and pan-fry it in butter. The onions would cook separately until they were golden and sweet. You'd serve the liver topped with those caramelized onions. This dish disappeared because organ meats fell out of favor. By the 1980s, Americans wanted muscle meat only. No organs, no variety meats, nothing that reminded them where their food came from. Liver became something you fed to the dog, not to your family. But liver is incredibly nutritious, packed with iron, vitamin A, and B vitamins. It's also sustainable, using the whole animal instead of just the choice cuts. Our great-grandmothers knew this. Maybe it's time we remembered. Corned beef with cabbage. Irish tradition transformed into American Sunday dinner. This wasn't just for St. Patrick's Day. In 1950s America, corned beef appeared on Sunday tables year-round, especially in cities with large Irish populations. You'd buy a corned beef brisket, simmer it for 3 hours until tender, then add cabbage, potatoes, and carrots during the last hour. A corned beef brisket cost about 60 cents per pound in 1950. That's roughly $7 today. A 3-pound brisket would cost about $1.80, roughly $20 today. Add vegetables, and the total was maybe $2.50, about $27 today. Betty Crocker's recipe included a trick. Add a tablespoon of sugar to the cooking water. This balanced the saltiness of the corned beef and helped the vegetables stay bright and colorful. The corned beef would simmer gently for 3 hours. You couldn't rush this. The meat needed time to become tender. During the last hour, you'd add quartered cabbage, potatoes, and carrots. Everything would finish cooking together, with the vegetables absorbing all those wonderful flavors from the meat. You'd serve this with mustard and horseradish on the side. The meat would be so tender you could cut it with a fork. The cabbage would be soft but not mushy. The potatoes would be creamy and flavorful. This dish didn't disappear. It just got relegated to 1 day per year. We decided corned beef was Irish food and only appropriate for St. Patrick's Day. But in 1950, this was just Sunday dinner, regardless of your heritage. Chicken tetrazzini, named after an Italian opera singer, perfected by American home cooks. This was casserole elegance. You'd combine cooked chicken, spaghetti, mushrooms, and a rich cream sauce made with sherry. Top it with Parmesan cheese and breadcrumbs, then bake until golden and bubbly. The result was comfort food that felt sophisticated. In 1950, this dish cost about $1.50 to make, roughly $17 today. The sherry was the expensive part, but a small bottle would last for multiple recipes. Betty Crocker's version used leftover chicken, usually from Sunday's roast chicken. This was Monday or Tuesday dinner, using Sunday's leftovers in a completely new way. Nothing was wasted. The technique involved making a bechamel sauce, butter, flour, and milk, then enriching it with cream and sherry. You'd cook the spaghetti until just barely done, because it would finish cooking in the oven. Mix everything together, transfer to a baking dish, top with cheese and breadcrumbs, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The result was creamy, rich, and indulgent. The spaghetti absorbed the sauce, the chicken stayed moist, the top became golden and crispy. Every bite had multiple textures and flavors. This dish disappeared when casseroles became unfashionable. By the 1990s, food magazines were mocking retro casseroles as unsophisticated. We moved toward plated meals, individual portions, cleaner presentations. But chicken tetrazzini is delicious. It's also practical. A perfect way to use leftovers and feed a crowd. Sometimes sophistication is overrated. Glazed meatloaf. Glazed meatloaf, not just any meatloaf, but Sunday meatloaf with a sweet tangy glaze. This was meatloaf elevated. You'd mix ground beef with breadcrumbs, eggs, onions, and seasonings, form it into a loaf, then top it with a glaze made from ketchup, brown sugar, and mustard. The glaze would caramelize during baking, creating a sweet savory crust that was absolutely addictive. In 1950, ground beef cost about 40 cents per pound. 2 pounds would cost 80 cents, roughly $9 today. Add breadcrumbs, eggs, and the glaze ingredients, and the total cost was about $1, roughly $11 today. Betty Crocker's recipe had specific proportions: 2 pounds of ground beef, 1 cup of breadcrumbs, 2 eggs, and 1 finely chopped onion. The mixture had to be mixed thoroughly, but not overmixed. Too much mixing would make the meatloaf dense and tough. The glaze was the secret. Half a cup of ketchup, a quarter cup of brown sugar, and a tablespoon of mustard. You'd spread it on top before baking. As the meatloaf cooked, the glaze would caramelize, creating that signature sweet tangy crust. The meatloaf would bake at 350 degrees for 1 hour. You'd let it rest for 10 minutes before slicing. This allowed the juices to redistribute, keeping every slice moist. This dish never really disappeared. Meatloaf is still common, but somewhere along the way, we forgot about the glaze. Modern recipes often skip it, serving plain meatloaf with ketchup on the side. But that glaze is what made Sunday meatloaf special. It transformed a simple dish into something memorable. Baked stuffed pork tenderloin, baked stuffed pork tenderloin, an elegant roast that looked impressive but was actually quite simple. You'd butterfly a pork tenderloin, pound it flat, spread it with stuffing, roll it up, and tie it with kitchen string. Then you'd roast it until golden and juicy. When you sliced it, each piece would have a beautiful spiral of meat and stuffing. In 1950, pork tenderloin cost about 50 cents per pound. A 2-pound tenderloin would cost $1, roughly $11 today. Add stuffing ingredients, and the total was maybe $1.50, about $17 today. Betty Crocker's technique for butterflying was specific. Place the tenderloin on a cutting board, hold your knife parallel to the board, and cut through the center of the meat, stopping about ½ an inch from the edge. Open it like a book. Pound it gently to an even thickness. The stuffing was simple: breadcrumbs, dried apricots, onions, and sage. You'd spread it over the flattened tenderloin, leaving a 1-inch border. Roll it up tightly, starting from a long side. Tie it with kitchen string at 2-inch intervals. The tenderloin would roast at 375 degrees for about 45 minutes. The outside would become golden and slightly crispy. The inside would stay incredibly juicy. When you sliced it, those spirals of meat and stuffing looked like something from a fancy restaurant. This dish disappeared because pork tenderloin got expensive. That cut that cost 50 cents per pound in 1950 now costs $8 to $12 per pound. Turkey divan. Turkey divan, the dish that turned Thanksgiving leftovers into Sunday dinner. This was casserole genius. You'd layer cooked broccoli in a baking dish, top it with sliced turkey, cover everything with a rich cheese sauce made with curry powder, then sprinkle with breadcrumbs and bake until golden and bubbly. In 1950, this dish cost about $1 to make using Thanksgiving leftovers. If you bought turkey specifically for it, the cost would be about $2, roughly $22 today. Betty Crocker's recipe included a surprising ingredient: curry powder. Just a teaspoon, but it added depth and complexity to the cheese sauce. This was exotic for 1950s America, when curry was still relatively unknown. The technique involved making a Mornay sauce, a cheese sauce enriched with egg yolks and cream. You'd cook the broccoli until just tender, arrange it in the baking dish, top it with turkey slices, pour the sauce over everything, and bake at 350 degrees for 30 minutes. The result was rich, creamy, and satisfying. The broccoli stayed bright green, the turkey stayed moist, the sauce became golden and bubbly. The breadcrumb topping added a satisfying crunch. This dish disappeared as casseroles fell out of fashion. But it's worth reviving, especially after Thanksgiving when everyone has leftover turkey. It's a complete meal in one dish: protein, vegetables, and starch. German tradition adapted for American Sunday tables. You'd take thin slices of beef, spread them with mustard, top them with bacon, onions, and pickles, roll them up, secure them with toothpicks, and braise them in beef stock until tender. The result was complex, flavorful, and absolutely delicious. In 1950, this dish cost about $1.50 to make, roughly $17 today. The beef was the expensive part. You needed thin slices of top round or sirloin. Betty Crocker's version simplified the traditional German recipe. Instead of making the beef rolls from scratch, she suggested asking the butcher to slice the meat thin, about 1/4 inch. This saved time and ensured even cooking. The technique was straightforward but required attention to detail. You'd spread each beef slice with mustard, lay a piece of bacon across it, add a spoonful of chopped onions and a pickle spear, then roll it up tightly and secure it with toothpicks. The rolls would brown in a hot pan, then braise in beef stock for 90 minutes. The braising liquid would reduce and thicken, becoming a rich gravy. You'd serve the rouladen with the gravy spooned over the top, usually alongside spätzle or mashed potatoes. This dish disappeared as German-American communities assimilated and younger generations stopped cooking traditional foods. By the 1970s, rouladen had become a curiosity, something you might find in a German restaurant but not in home kitchens. But it's delicious and worth reviving. Those flavors, mustard, bacon, pickles, beef, create something greater than the sum of their parts. Chicken cacciatore, Italian hunter's stew transformed into American Sunday dinner. You'd brown chicken pieces in olive oil, then simmer them with tomatoes, bell peppers, onions, mushrooms, and wine. The result was rustic, hearty, and deeply flavorful. This was Italian-American cooking at its finest. In 1950, this dish cost about $1.25 to make, roughly $14 today. A whole chicken cost about 60 cents. Add vegetables and wine, and you had a complete meal for a family of 6. Betty Crocker's version used canned tomatoes instead of fresh. This was practical for year-round cooking and actually resulted in more consistent flavor. She also added a bay leaf and oregano, herbs that weren't traditional in Italian cooking but had become standard in Italian-American cuisine. The technique was simple. Brown the chicken pieces in olive oil, remove them, sauté the vegetables, add the tomatoes and wine, return the chicken to the pot, and simmer for 45 minutes. The chicken would become tender, the sauce would thicken, and all the flavors would meld together. You'd serve this over pasta or with crusty bread for soaking up that incredible sauce. Every bite had chicken, vegetables, and that rich tomato wine sauce. This dish didn't disappear. Chicken cacciatore is still relatively common, but modern versions often use boneless, skinless chicken breasts, which cook quickly but lack the flavor and richness of bone-in, skin-on pieces. We traded authenticity for convenience. 25 recipes down, 5 more to go. These last 5 are the rarest of the rare, the dishes that appeared in Betty Crocker's cookbook for only a few years before disappearing completely, the recipes that even vintage cookbook collectors have trouble finding. But they're also the most interesting. They represent experiments, innovations, attempts to create something new from traditional ingredients. Some of them failed. That's why they disappeared. But some of them were actually brilliant and deserve to be rediscovered. Let's finish this journey. Mock duck. And no, there's no duck in it at all. This was Depression-era ingenuity carried into the 1950s. You'd take a flank steak, pound it flat, spread it with bread stuffing, roll it up, tie it, and roast it. When sliced, it supposedly looked like duck. It didn't, really, but it was delicious anyway. In 1950, flank steak cost about 40 cents per pound. A 2-pound flank steak would cost 80 cents, roughly $9 today. Add stuffing ingredients, and the total cost was about $1.25, roughly $14 today. Betty Crocker's recipe was specific about the pounding. You needed to pound the flank steak until it was about half an inch thick and roughly rectangular. This took effort. Flank steak is tough and fibrous, but it was essential for the dish to work. Tamale pie, Tex-Mex comfort food in casserole form. This was American interpretation of Mexican cuisine. You'd make a spicy ground beef, filling with tomatoes, corn, and chili powder, pour it into a baking dish, top it with cornmeal batter, and bake until the topping became golden and crusty. In 1950, this dish cost about $1 to make, roughly $11 today. Ground beef was 40 cents per pound. Cornmeal was practically free. Canned tomatoes and corn were cheap. Betty Crocker's recipe was straightforward. Brown ground beef with onions, add tomatoes, corn, chili powder, and cumin. Then simmer for 15 minutes. Pour this into a baking dish. Top with a batter made from cornmeal, flour, eggs, and milk. Bake at 400 degrees for 30 minutes. The result was a complete meal in one dish. The beef filling was spicy and savory. The cornmeal topping was like cornbread but slightly denser, with a crispy top and a soft interior. Everything baked together, with the flavors melding and intensifying. This dish disappeared as Americans developed more sophisticated tastes in Mexican food. By the 1980s, tamale pie seemed inauthentic, a relic of a time when Mexican food meant ground beef and chili powder. We wanted real Mexican cuisine, not American interpretations. But tamale pie wasn't trying to be authentic Mexican food. It was American comfort food, inspired by Mexican flavors. And on those terms, it succeeded beautifully. Sweetbreads in cream sauce, the most elegant organ meat dish in Betty Crocker's repertoire. Sweetbreads are the thymus gland of young calves or lambs. In 1950, they were considered a delicacy, something you served at special Sunday dinners. You'd poach them, slice them, sauté them in butter, then finish them with a rich cream sauce. In 1950, sweetbreads cost about 60 cents per pound. That's roughly $7 today. A pound would feed 4 people. Add cream, butter, and mushrooms, and the total cost was about $1.50, roughly $17 today. Betty Crocker's technique was specific. First, you'd soak the sweetbreads in cold water for 2 hours to remove any blood. Then, you'd poach them gently in simmering water for 15 minutes. After poaching, you'd peel away the outer membrane and slice them into medallions. The sweetbreads would sauté in butter for just 2 to 3 minutes per side. Then you'd make a quick cream sauce in the same pan: butter, flour, cream, and a splash of sherry. The sweetbreads would go back into the sauce just to warm through. The result was incredibly tender, with a delicate flavor and creamy texture. Sweetbreads don't taste like other meats. They're milder, almost sweet, with a texture somewhere between liver and chicken. Jellied veal loaf? Yes, it's exactly what it sounds like, and yes, it was popular. This was aspic taken to its logical extreme. You'd cook veal with vegetables and seasonings, chop everything finely, mix it with gelatin, pour it into a loaf pan, and refrigerate until firm. You'd slice it cold and serve it with mayonnaise. In 1950, this dish cost about $1.50 to make, roughly $17 today. Veal shoulder was relatively cheap. Gelatin was a pantry staple. Betty Crocker's recipe was detailed: simmer veal shoulder with celery, onions, carrots, and bay leaf for 2 hours. Remove the veal, chop it finely, strain the broth, add gelatin to the hot broth. Mix in the chopped veal and vegetables, pour into a loaf pan, and refrigerate overnight. The result was a firm, sliceable loaf with bits of veal and vegetables suspended in savory gelatin. You'd serve it sliced, garnished with lettuce and tomatoes, with mayonnaise on the side. This dish disappeared because gelatin-based savory dishes fell completely out of fashion. By the 1970s, aspic had become a punchline, something people mocked in vintage cookbooks. We couldn't understand why anyone would want meat in gelatin. But in 1950, this was considered elegant, modern, and sophisticated. Gelatin represented food science and progress. It was a way to preserve meat without canning, to create something that looked impressive on the table. Times change, tastes change. What was sophisticated becomes ridiculous, but jellied veal loaf was a real dish that real people really enjoyed. Crown pork. Roast with fruit stuffing. We're ending where we began, with a crown roast, but this time with a twist. This was the most elaborate Sunday dinner in Betty Crocker's repertoire. A crown roast of pork, just like recipe number 1, but filled with fruit stuffing instead of savory stuffing. Dried apricots, prunes, apples, and raisins mixed with breadcrumbs and spices. The combination of pork and fruit was considered the height of sophistication. In 1955, this roast cost about $4 to make, roughly $43 today. The dried fruit was expensive, but this fed 12 to 15 people, making it economical for large gatherings. Betty Crocker's recipe was elaborate. Prepare the crown roast as before. Make the fruit stuffing by soaking dried fruit in warm water, then mixing it with breadcrumbs, butter, cinnamon, and nutmeg. Fill the center of the crown with stuffing. Roast at 325 degrees for 3 hours, basting every 30 minutes. The result was spectacular. The pork stayed juicy. The fruit stuffing became sweet, tender, and infused with pork drippings. The combination of savory pork and sweet fruit was complex and delicious. This dish disappeared for the same reason as the original crown roast, time and availability, but also because sweet-savory combinations fell out of favor. We decided that fruit belonged in dessert, not in the main course, but this roast represented something important: the willingness to spend time, effort, and attention on Sunday dinner. The belief that a meal could be an event, a celebration, a way to show love to your family. That's what all 30 of these recipes represent. 30 recipes. 30 Sunday dinners that used to be on every American table. Every single one of these dishes required time. They required technique. They required attention and care. You couldn't rush them. You couldn't shortcut them. You had to be present, involved, committed, and that's exactly why they disappeared. We traded these recipes for convenience, for rotisserie chickens and pre-made meals, for dinners that took 15 minutes instead of 3 hours. We told ourselves we were being efficient, modern, practical. But what did we lose? We lost the ritual of Sunday cooking, the smell of a roast in the oven all morning, the knowledge that dinner was hours away but already in progress, already filling the house with anticipation. We lost the techniques, the ability to turn tough cuts tender, the knowledge of how to stuff a roast, braise short ribs, or make perfect dumplings. We lost the economics. These recipes fed families of 6 to 8 for $2 or $3. They used inexpensive cuts and made them delicious. They wasted nothing. We lost the connection. The bones turned golden. The exterior of the lamb developed a dark, crispy crust, and the stuffing in the center absorbed all the lamb flavor. The flavor of crown roast of lamb with couscous stuffing was complex and luxurious. The lamb was rich, slightly gamey, and intensely flavorful, much more so than beef or pork. The garlic rosemary crust added aromatics and a slight bitterness that balanced the lamb's richness. The couscous stuffing was a revelation, fluffy and light, but loaded with sweet dried fruits, crunchy nuts, and warm spices. Every bite combined tender lamb, crispy crust, and fragrant stuffing. The dried apricots added tartness, the dates added caramel-like sweetness, the pistachios and almonds added crunch, and the spices tied everything together. The presentation of this dish was absolutely stunning. You'd bring the crown roast to the table whole, the bones pointing up like a crown, the couscous stuffing piled high in the center, the exterior of the lamb dark and caramelized. Sunday dinner wasn't just about food. It was about family, tradition, taking time to be together. It was a weekly reminder that some things are worth doing slowly, carefully, with attention and love. These recipes are more than food history. They're cultural artifacts. They're windows into a way of life that prioritize different things than we prioritize now. I'm not saying we should go back to the 1950s. That era had plenty of problems. But maybe we can learn something from these recipes. Maybe we can reclaim some of what we lost. Here's my challenge to you. Pick one of these 30 recipes and make it. Give yourself permission to spend 3 hours on Sunday dinner. Fill your house with the smell of something wonderful cooking slowly. Gather your family around the table and serve them something they've never tasted before. Bring back Sunday dinner. Bring back these forgotten recipes. Bring back the art of taking time with food. Because these recipes, they're not really forgotten. They're just waiting to be remembered. I've got 30 more forgotten recipes coming next week. This time, we're diving into Betty Crocker's forgotten breakfast and brunch recipes. Things like baked grapefruit with brown sugar, creamed eggs on toast points, and overnight coffee cake that you started the night before. Let me know in the comments which of these 30 Sunday dinners you remember from your childhood. Which ones did your grandmother make? Which ones are you going to try? And if you make one of these recipes, tag me. I want to see these forgotten dishes coming back to life. Sunday dinner is worth saving. Let's save it together.